Good afternoon, everyone. I know some folks are still coming in and joining us, but welcome to our second session of Unmasking Racism and Anti-Racism Education, Youth Ministry, with the Reverend Dr. Gia Brown. Jill Olds was unable to be with us today, so I'm going to be managing the Q&A for Gia. Please just drop those in the chat, and we're going to have a time of questions a little bit later. I know we've got a lot to get to, so I'm going to turn it right over.
Hello, everyone. I would say good morning, depending on where you are in the country. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. And if you're watching the recording, hello to you as well. My name is Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown, and thank you for prioritizing this conversation, the second session in our webinar series about unmasking the racism within anti-racism education. We'll be together for the next 90 minutes. A fair amount will be us being able to have some conversation through the chat to answer some questions and to dig a little bit deeper, just to kind of position ourselves so we kind of know where we are. We started last week kind of giving an overarching view as we looked into what racism, kind of the seeds of racism and how they have started, and how we can find them in our anti-racism education, particularly when we're exploring children, youth, and family ministry. And this week, this session, we'll actually be digging deeper into some of these frameworks, some of the traditional ones that we've grown accustomed to, that we use, as well as looking into what are some of the qualifiers and the scaffolding that's needed to look for or to find or create an anti-racism curriculum for children, youth, and family ministry. So we're going to dig right in because Kelly was right. We have, there's quite a bit here to share and to discuss here. And I'm going to just move so I can put my slides here into presentation view. There we go. And we will go ahead and dig right in. So just to kind of let us know kind of where we are and how we're going to spend our time together. I'm a big fan of agendas, so we know what to expect. We're going to start just by having a very quick recap of our definitions and our qualifiers for people that may have missed the session last week, but also just to kind of familiarize ourselves with our starting point. Then we're going to dig, like I said, into the traditional educational models. We will pivot into looking into the qualifiers of anti-racism education models, and we're going to touch a bit on locating and engaging those models as we turn to our Q&A time and our closing remarks at the end. So your questions that you have, save them, as Kelly said, put them in the chat, and we will review. We will find time to circle back to those before our time ends, I promise. So let's go ahead and dig in. There we go. There we go. Let's just familiarize ourselves with where we are and where we have been. And we're talking about racism here. I pulled up online. This was the definition I used last week. Looking into the Oxford Dictionary of defining racism, the prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, a community, or an institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is minority or marginalized. And I highlighted this last week because I know that there are conversations, depending on, on your circle and your networks, about this last piece where my cursor is, and whether or not, and kind of the power dynamics of racism as it relates to who can be racist and who, and that discussion. And we're not going to focus on that. We're going to really highlight this area here about right here. We're talking about anti-racism efforts that truly support this area where it's typically targeted towards someone who is a minority or a marginalized group. And what I really appreciate about this kind of this widening of this definition is that it allows us to really take a 360-degree view of not only racism, but its impacts and its qualifiers. And part of it is also looking at defining racism for people in regard to widening beyond the physical elements of racism. I think a lot of us, when we think about racism, we look for the blatant acts, which we talked about last week. We look for the physical, tangible evidence, and oftentimes there is tangible and physical evidence, but racism is widened, excuse me, beyond that to look at these different characteristics, right? There's violence that's here when we're looking at, as Mayan Leitran discusses, the erosion of essential vitality and the rationalization of racism by normalizing these built-in traditional logics. Anytime we see these elements where there's division or superiority, where there's mistreatment or exclusionary treatment, these are qualifiers that lean into the definition where we're able to identify that there might be some elements of racism in our spaces. And so digging right in now into our traditional educational models. Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. I thought it'd be really great to go right to the source. So as we're kind of starting off our discussion, let's look at what we do know. Let's start from our own starting point, which is usually, the traditional educational models and frameworks that we have grown accustomed to, that we ourselves, if we're educators, that we have been students in, right? We're steeped in this learning. Every teacher was a student first, right? And every teacher is and was a learner. And so I thought I'd go right back to the kind of the basics, right? And look at this, back to the basics. Here's my cursor. I love this. I went to Wikipedia. I thought if I'm looking for a basic, widespread definition or explanation, I couldn't think of any other wider space or source to go to than Wikipedia. So I went to Wikipedia and I typed in traditional education, and these are some of the pieces that popped up. So let's look at these. So first, they're actually Wikipedia defines traditional education. Back to the basics, conventional education, customary education, and refers to long established customs that society has traditionally used in schools. Long established customs, traditional, that society has traditionally used in schools. So right there, right off the top, we're able to see where the power dynamic is. Society, whoever is at the center of society has deemed this here, has deemed this framework, this traditional education, is what is needed in terms of teaching our students. And why is that? Why do we have this? Why do we have this education? The primary purpose is to continue passing on these skills, the skills that society has deemed are important, the skills, the facts, and the standards of moral and social conduct that adults consider to be necessary for the next generation's material advancement. This is on Wikipedia. The primary purpose of traditional education is to continue passing on these skills and the facts. Look, the standards of moral and social conduct. So here we are, here's society. So whoever is at the center of society is also determining what are the skills that are needed? What are the facts that are needed? What is the learning, the education that's needed for this particular student or group of students to be able to move forward, right, in society, in their roles in society, that society has deemed is critical, right? That adults consider to be necessary for the next generation's material advancement. All right, so who does this? And look at the who of the function and the roles. All of this on Wikipedia. Teachers are the instruments by which this knowledge is communicated and these standards of behavior are enforced. So when we're looking at what is the role of teachers in this traditional model, their role is to be instruments, right? So instruments. Things are passing through. They are instrumental. They participate. They contribute, right? Teachers are instruments by which the knowledge is communicated. Look at this. And they're enforcers of the standards of behavior. So they're kind of a cog in the larger system. Even in these three segments, we're actually getting a really good, really good kind of perspective on how our society's frameworks are designed, right? And who has the power, who are the deciding factors. And we can also, putting on our lenses, right, which we're working on, we're able to kind of see where some of these gaps may be presented, whether intentionally or otherwise, right? And so right now, they are instruments, right? The knowledge is communicated. So it's interesting, right? I have said this before, and I know I said this last week, and I say this all the time, that I am a word nerd. I love language. And so for me as a pastor, getting into the exegetical, the word pieces, words matter. And so I hope you'll allow me a couple of moments here as we're looking into some of these words. So as we're looking in here and we're looking at the fact that teachers are instruments by which the knowledge is communicated, that means that they are passing along this knowledge. What's interesting here is that because they are communicating this, there's nothing to say that they are originating, that they are creating, that they are developing. But in this traditional model, they are, right? They're kind of the conduit for how this information is passing. That is kind of how we see that. And that's important because even though this is traditional education, right, as we see that long established customs, a lot of our contemporary education models, they derive, if not fully embrace, this model. This has been known as a trusted model that's here. So basically what I'm looking at then is, here's this big cog machine. Welcome to my imaginary brain, right? Here's this big, huge machine. And this is what I'm imagining. And teachers are just a cog in this machine, which means that they are not necessarily sharing their ideas. They may not necessarily be sharing their beliefs, but they are passing along this information and enforcing this behavior as they have been taught and conditioned to do. Everyone has a role to play in the machine. You see that? Everyone has a role to play. Students have a role to play. Teachers have a role to play. But that also means that if teachers are passing along this information, right? Sometimes they're innovating, right? But oftentimes, right? If for me as someone who was in education, right? I'm right at that intersection of ministry, education, faith education, and justice. So I've been an educator for a really long time. And one of the things I find is sometimes I'm creating curriculum, but a lot of times I'm teaching and sharing what someone else has created, which means it may not even be about it. I may not be able to contribute my thoughts or my beliefs, but my role is just to pass this on, which means I'm limited by what I can share. I'm limited by what students are learning based upon what I'm providing in the classroom. Okay. This is what is really important for us as we're looking at these traditional models. So let's look at this a little bit more. Let's dig in a little bit more here into what traditional learning models, what they look like. And we're going to come back to this Wikipedia. I don't want to make you dizzy, but we're going to come back to this because look at some of the things that we can see, some of the criteria. So in these traditional learning models, what we're finding is that they're teacher-centered, right? If teachers are the conduit, teachers are the ones that are sharing information, then they're centered on what the teacher is sharing. The learning is centered around what the teacher is sharing. Okay. And it also shows that students then, I'm going to go on back up. Don't want to make you dizzy, but we're talking about the role of teachers, but students are here to receive, right, the skills, the facts, and the standards of moral and social conduct. And this is even assuming we're talking about children, right? Right? That adults are the teachers, and we're not even talking about adult ed. But just to kind of see this, the role here, students are learners. So they're here to receive the information, receiving, right? When we think about what that looks like, I'll come back to this white leadership and governments in a moment. But let's look at kind of some of these approaches and what this looks like. So if students are only learners, they're here to receive. All right. And so what that means is because we're receiving, they're kind of open armed and receiving whatever is coming in. And so part of receiving, look on the side here, these are kind of receiving pieces. Are examples of this would be a lot of listening. listening to the lectures, listening to the videos, listening to what's being shared, orally reciting what they've learned to prove that they have retained the information that's been shared with them, right? There is testing, multiple choice, answering these questions, regurgitating what has been taught. Do you know these facts? Do you know these standards? Is this important? And then also this idea of a banking, right? This banking, if you think about going to the bank and you deposit money, excuse me, banking is like that's what this is, this idea of depositing information. I'm just depositing it, and you can listen as I deposit, and we can test you as I deposit, and if you can recite what I have shared, then that tells me that you have learned, right? And what have you learned? You have learned what society has deemed is important for you to learn. If you can regurgitate what it is that has been taught, what you have learned, then what society has deemed is important for you to learn, you have surpassed, you have met that, you've met that qualifier, you've met that standard here in traditional models. Now, who are the learners, who are the teachers, and who are the students in these traditional models? Who tends to be at the front of the classroom? We tend to see our white leadership. We tend to see teachers that are white. They tend to be identifying as male, middle or upper class. If we're in faith spaces, they tend to be Christian. They tend to embody the standards of what a student, a learner would be aspiring to. A teacher that's standing in the front of a classroom, right, in a traditional context. I'm not just talking about traditionally what you're learning, I'm talking about even the layout. You imagine here's someone that's standing at the front of the classroom. They're standing, everyone else is sitting. There's already a power dynamic. And they're speaking out to the masses, to the classroom, and students are there to receive. They're there to receive all that is shared. And at the front is someone who's not only sharing, who's also known as, they might be the gatekeeper. They're the ones that are grading. They're the ones that are testing. Does that sound familiar? And so we're looking ahead at them as students. We're looking at teachers, and they are embodying the standard of where we want to go. They are embodying who we, as students, when we grow into adults, right? They are embodying that piece. And that's important because that communicates then that they meet the standard. So when we're thinking about this, as I'm going back, I told you I'm a word nerd. Look at this. They meet the standard then. So teachers, then, if they're the instruments, then they meet the standards of the behavior that is enforced. They are modeling the standards of moral and social conduct. So basically looking at, in a traditional framework, the person who is leading, the person who is teaching is then modeling and embodying who I as a student should want to be, how I should, my posture, my behavior, what I should know. They're embodying that. Why am I driving this home so much? We'll see in a moment. All right, let's go back to this. So we know here now that this is typically what we see in traditional learning methods. I'm not talking about our intention. I'm not talking about our hearts. We're just talking about truly the way that that our learning spaces have been designed, intentionally designed and cultivated, right? They also tend to be, colonized approaches are these right here. If you can just prove that you know what you've been taught, if you can check the box, and this aligns with our ideas, right, in white supremacy culture of what it means to be successful, what it means to be able to have reached a particular point, is if we can check this box. So these traditional learning methods tend to be one note. Then they're not intersectional. They tend to be really focused on one particular lens. Usually, if I'm teaching something, I'm teaching through the lens, or I'm teaching a particular perspective or vantage point from the authors or the people that have generated the information I'm teaching, right? So the textbook writers and all of those things, I'm sharing that. But who tends to be the person who is the writer of the material? Usually people who are writing the curriculum, the people who are designing and deciding, these things. If it's white leadership in governments, for example, in the majority, then these are the people that are, and then these are people that are deciding these standards here. It's reasonable to believe then that the type of curriculum that is being utilized then comes from people who have not only decided these standards, but also probably benefit from them as well. So when we're thinking about what's happening in these frameworks, we're looking at even the content of the material then tends to be from the lens of whoever's writing it. It'd be really challenging for me. I'm a big fan of authors that are able to write and embody a different persona as they're writing, which I think it takes an incredible amount of research and imagination. It's a gift to be able to do that. In terms of developing curriculum for our learning spaces, especially kind of in our public learning spaces right now in our society, we are limited by the extent of our teachers' knowledge and beliefs. So there, whoever the person is that is writing the curriculum, they're sharing from their lenses. And then that gets passed on to the teacher who shares it also through that lens as well. And so then whoever is on the side of the learner, the student, then what I'm receiving is I'm receiving information deemed to be aligned with my standards and conduct as decided and experienced by the person who wrote the book. I know we went on a big winding rabbit trail, but it really important. You're following me, right? So they had to, so this is kind of where we are. So even as someone who's sitting here, if I'm studying a particular, if we're in a particular class and we're learning about history, it's important whose history are we learning and whose narrative are we telling? Because based upon traditional education, as a teacher, I'm a conduit. I'm sharing this information, which means that I'm exempt from oftentimes we see accountability. Sometimes I'll say I'm just the right. I'm just the messenger. That's what I think about every time I see this. And I think about teachers. I think about, hey, I'm just the messenger. I'm passing this information along. Traditional learning methods are usually limited by, again, like I said, the extent of the teacher's knowledge and their beliefs. Usually they're a la carte, they're palatable, they're comfortable, particularly in adult ed, where we want to say, we really, really want for you to learn this information, and we're going to make it as easy and as seamless as we can. We're not changing the content of the material. These are kind of modern day approaches, right? As we kind of, I say, we dress up traditional learning models, is they will still be, the content will still be traditional. But what we'll find is that we'll say, go at your pace. Take what you'd like. Move in the mode that you'd like to move through in terms of gathering your information and your data. But it doesn't change the fact that the framework is still traditional, even in our 2024 Zoom world. We're still embraced in this. You'll find that even in traditional learning models, we'll find that they will be political, politically, especially in our more progressive traditional learning methods, we find that they're emotionally neutral. We don't really talk a lot about the emotions, about what's happening. We are just factual. White supremacy culture, specifically, we focus on checking the boxes and showing that we have met. Look at all of that. We've done all of this, but it's really hard to gauge emotion from an objective standpoint. It's really challenging to do that. And so usually emotions are moved out of the way, and they're not regarded much. We focus just on facts and data. And we'll see as we continue down this journey how that has evolved and contributed to where we are. Finally, we see that with traditional learning methods, it is textbook or academic based and supported. So usually, if I'm coming in order for me to say that I'm teaching something, I've got to qualify it to say that this is really something that's important because it's supported in this particular book. It's supported in here, which means that it is academic based and supported. But the challenge is that the people who tend to be in academia, are largely white folks and white males, usually. The lens of the people who are tasked with writing the textbooks are people who may not be navigating or may not be navigating the ripple effects that racism, institutional racism causes. And if they're not personally navigating or experiencing those, then we may not find information, we may not find those nuances in the curriculum and the materials that we're teaching, right? And so then we have matters of erasure. Then we move into matters of invisibility and the challenges that we have here. And so just to kind of, I know that you're with me, but just as we're seeing how this is going. These are the traditional models and kind of what we're seeing. Now, I want to also dig in a little bit here to this separation by gender, class, and ethnicity and perceived abilities, because sometimes this also happens, right? Is that even in some of these traditional models, we'll see that, thinking back historically, there was this belief, I'm not going to make you dizzy, by those people that determine the standards of moral and social conduct. Well, does everybody need to learn everything? Does everybody need to learn about Piaget and about James Cone? And is that really important for everybody? Well, if I'm living in, here we are, societal standards, right, and the customs that are here, well, there's some beliefs that there are some people that don't need to learn all of these things, right? You think about historically, women were not invited into certain academic spaces and still are not invited into some academic spaces. And this belief that, you know what, if women are not going to work in professional spaces, then really what they need are classes for them to be functional in where they are, for the generation's next material advancement. And so as women, if women are not going to be in professional spaces, if women are not going to be in leadership or running for president or doing anything else like that, then they don't need those types of skills. Certainly based upon where we are in our, in our era, in the age, you're thinking back to to women that weren't in those spaces. And so sewing and cooking classes and, information about child rearing. I am the originator of an anti-racism project called the Action Project. And one of the things I located was an old booklet which listed out what the lessons were that women and girls needed in the 30s, 20s, and 30s, 1920s and 30s. And it was interesting. It was sewing, and it was cooking, and it was posture, and it was walking, right? And it was conversation. These were pieces that were part of critical pieces and elements. This is what this was. And then for boys and men, they were learning things about math and certain skill sets and certain trades. And so and I know this isn't new news to many of you, but this is important for us to recognize that even if society is deciding. So if those who are determining at the center of society decide what people need to know and how they need to know, and even to say that based upon, gender or class or ethnicity or even perceived abilities, we're going to decide for you what it is that you need to know. And so these traditional learning models, then, they were limited. This is why I say we're limited. Because now we're limited by not only the teacher's knowledge and beliefs, but what society is saying of who we can be and where we can go and how we can grow. We're limited by that in these traditional spaces. All right, so I'm going to keep on going. You can tell I'm very passionate about this. And one of the things I thought about was I thought it'd be really great to look at for just a couple of moments what this looks like in real time to be limited. Excuse me. So last month, I traveled to Cape Town, South Africa, for a conference at the Humphrey Institute that the Humphrey Institute held. They held their 6th World Conference to highlight remedies to address racial and global inequalities. It was pretty amazing. So I was in Cape Town, South Africa, where cultures and customs are very different. And one of the things that we found just with the end of apartheid in the early 90s was there was a separation that was happening. You look at this, right? A Population Registration Act as of 1950, and it stayed in effect and largely we still see elements of this today in Cape Town. But even the separation of people of classes, there's a white person, right? There's a native, and look at this. And I'm going to say this because in that context, as a colored person, you see there's a you here. This is actually an appropriate term in Cape Town in South Africa. This is an appropriate designation. It is not appropriate here, but it is appropriate in Cape Town, South Africa. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is look at this, the designations. So someone who appears is accepted as a white person, right? And look, they tell you, but does not include a person who, although in appearance may be a white person, is accepted as a colored person. And then here's native, someone who is in fact or is generally accepted as a member of any of the Aboriginal race or tribes of Africa. And then here is a colored person who is not a white person or a native. So when I went to South Africa, when I was there last month, I was told that I would be considered a colored person. So someone who's not native to South Africa, to that country, and someone who's not considered white. And what happens is the way these classes they were intentionally separated um, and divided here. And not only were they divided just based upon skin color, but they were also divided based upon their educational backgrounds and their abilities. There were certain, and we spent time learning about this. There's the University of Cape Town where the conference was held, it's so young. It's a baby college, baby university in the 90s. And part of the reason was because there were limitations. So people who would be considered to be native could only attend or take certain classes and certain courses. People who were colored were only allowed to learn certain things and apply for certain jobs, right? And so we have this, and to see it in real time and so recent, from post-apartheid is really, it's really mind-boggling. But to kind of see this is really important because we're able to see then what it looks like in real time. So it wasn't even a glass ceiling. It was a real intentional ceiling. Oh, I'm sorry, you're native. So then because you're native, this is the extent of where you're able to go, and not just physically go, right? With, in terms of location, certain places they were not able to go, but also in terms of intellectual spaces and learning that they were not able to go, as well as people who would be considered part of this, right? This colored person space and then the white person space. So to see it in real time. And so even today, which is what I'm doing the math, 30-ish years, right? 40 years past, we're 40 years. 30 years past post-apartheid, even to kind of see this, we're able, you can see it. You can even see where the division still remains, and where the gaps are still there. You can see where the inequality is still there and where the limitation is. So even the effects of these traditional educational models they're the harm that they create, that they generate, is exponential and long lasting. One of the things that I saw was important. You'll see up here too. Let me go back. My cursor here is one of the signs that were out for people that are now in museums and historical spaces. But I think is really important. But this is something that's important too. So while I was in Cape Town, South Africa, I traveled to Robben Island, and this is the place where Nelson Mandela and many others were unjustly imprisoned, some for their entire lives. And one of the things that I saw, which I thought was important for and contributing to our conversation, is because if we're talking about traditional educational models, I'm going to scoop back up a little bit. So one of the things I want to name is that while this happens here, and we assume it's happening in, like I talked about, a traditional classroom where there's a teacher that's standing at the front, which is kind of the gatekeeper, the embodiment of who we think we should become or become like, and students are down here and looking forward. But learning also doesn't happen in that way, right? People are taught and are conditioned in terms of how to be and how to respond and how to behave. And so I pulled this because I thought this was important, that even with this separation that we're looking at here, these separations that are here, look at how it manifested on Robben Island, right? And so you'll see this here. You'll see this as coloreds and Asiatics, and then over here it says Bantus. Okay, and the difference between the diet. So Bantu is a native tribe that in South Africa, and over here would be considered those people. And so we're looking at, look at this. So even people who were considered to be, let's start over here with C, because it went A, B, C, D. So right, A were white folks, B, C, and D. Okay, all right. So, so over here, look at this. So people who were considered Bantu, who were considered to be native, they got a 12. Look at, they got a meal. They got lunch. Look, they got 5 ounces of meat, no jam, no syrup. Look, they got it says 1.5 ounces of sugar. Do you see that? And you can kind of see what they had here. But look over here, where you can see that you'll see over here that there's been 1 ounce of fat daily versus half an ounce here. Here is their lunch that's right here versus, there's bread at both lunch and supper here. You can see that there's rice or soup that's here, more meat, jam, and syrup. So even I share this because this is true. This is the learning model. So even learning that based upon who I am, there are certain places I can go. The traditional learning models are teaching are all around us and have been teaching them even here the distinctions between our appearance and our distinctions between our appearance and our progress and where we're going. These are the effects of the traditional models that we're seeing that are very candid and that are very blatant. This was a sign that was out. These are signs that were out. So traditional educational models are also very intentional about where they're going and about who's being centered. And I think that that's important for us to be able to see as we're looking at things, because a lot of times even understanding the why, how we got here and why we got here, is important for us to be able to for us to figure out how we can move forward. So let's look at then, I'm going to transition now into qualifiers, into what are we looking at in contrast. Don't want to make you dizzy again, okay? But in contrast to these traditional learning that we've grown accustomed to seeing, and now we're looking into this, this engaged pedagogy. So then what do? This is what we know. This is what we know. This is what we've seen. Look, even this prison, this is what we know. So then what do? How do we move beyond this? What can something else look like? Are we even capable of imagining something that looks different than what we've been steeped in for so long? And this is what I've developed, and just for my own research and my own work as well, is something that Bell Hooks coins as engaged pedagogy. And let's kind of look at this a little bit. Let's take a little bit of time and let's look at this and think about the lens of youth ministry as we're talking about this. So engaged pedagogy means there's engaging. So right off the top, I'm a word person, we're already engaging. So now the engagement means that there's conversation. It means that there's relationship. It means that there's give and take here. Students and teachers are considered interchangeable. That means that the teacher may be the one that is convening and organizing the space or facilitating the space, but it also means that they are willing to receive information, that they are participating in the learning experience, that they are contributing to the learning experience, and teachers in that role share the responsibility of learning with their students, which means they qualify students' experiences and their contributions as meaningful to the space. So because of that, there's no more I'm depositing, right? Because everyone is teaching and everyone is learning. So it creates this space. In my mind, I envision the difference between a traditional learning classroom where the teacher's in the front and students are kind of sitting, paying attention in their desks and watching, right? Versus maybe and again, just as a model for your mind's view of a circle. Right? Traditional learning, again, I told you the power dynamic. Here's this teacher that's standing up in the front and everyone else is sitting below them. And here, this is a saying that we're all together. Maybe we're all sitting together. But there's this interchangeable and this learning dynamic where everyone contributes and everyone is held accountable here. Experience carries authority. So yes, the textbooks are important, but they're just one authoritative space. They're just one. But lived experience carries authority as well. In traditional models, experience and contributions, they're not, usually sought out. We're looking for the factual data, but emotion is an experience, right? Our validation, our feelings, our journey is in our experience. Our lens is in our experience. So if I wanted for me to have engaged pedagogy, it means that I find your lens valuable versus in a traditional learning pedagogy, right? In these traditional frameworks, I have no it does your opinions are not, as a student, your opinions are not the priority. What's important is making sure that I have done my part in conveying, passing on the information to you. So even to say that experience carries authority here, it's saying then that whoever's coming in, regardless of age or context, that what they have to contribute, that their voice, that it matters, and that there is some value to their experience, which totally upsets the traditional learning models, right? Totally upsets the traditional models, which carries in a superiority lens to say that there's a particular person or lens or viewpoint that is ideal and centered. So now everyone's experience carries authority. And if the world is our classroom, then that means that we're getting beyond what's happening in the constraints of the brick and mortar. That now we're able to look at what's happening by the world being our classroom, at current events, at what's happening in society globally, in different cultures, in different countries, different lenses that are here. So now we're not necessarily saying that we're negating all of our textbooks and academic pieces, but engaged pedagogy says that a textbook or this that we've used is just one of the areas. So I'm not saying we negate it all, but just one of the lenses. But if the world is our classroom, then we're open to qualify, to explore, other lenses and other narratives as well. And it also says that multiple teaching strategies are embraced. So yes, there are some traditional learning models and traditional spaces where lectures and where students are sitting in a particular space, and there's someone who's at the front, and sometimes that is the case, and sometimes that's the best format for the content that's being shared and delivered. But also, multiple teaching strategies embrace means that that we're also looking at other ways that people are learning. That some are, and I think about this as an educator. I used to be an early childhood educator, which makes sense as a mom of five, right? But I used to be an early childhood educator. And one of the things I would tell people is that there are 6 different ways that people learn, right? So some people, instruction is one, but self-discovery is another, and auditory, right? And visual, and engagement, interactive. These are all different ways that we learn from our peers. As a mother of a teen, of a teenager right now, I know that I'm not the only one that's teaching him, right? I know that he's getting information from his peers and from his classmates and from other sources like social media, which we talked about last week. Like, we know this. And so multiple teaching strategies embrace is saying that we're recognizing the presence of information from different sources, and we're willing to bring it in to examine and to explore, that we are finding that there's also authority in that too. Because if experience carries authority, then we're going to find experience then embedded in the teaching strategies, which means that now we're widening who gets to be a teacher. We get to widen that. We get to widen who's qualified as a teacher, and what learning is. Now we get to redefine what is learning, and which is really important, right? You find that because it's intersectional. Because if experience carries authority, then it isn't one note. It's not just through one particular lens. That means that if everyone's able to contribute, then that means that now we're intersectional. Intersectional talks about the fact that for me, as someone who identifies, I'm African American, but I'm not only African American. I also identify as I'm also a woman. And there's an intersection that's here. 2 marginalized groups that navigate their own lives and challenges intersecting, and then you add the fact that I'm also queer. So these are three, so the intersections of that, those nuances, this is an identity. I'm not only an African American, but I'm also an African American who happens to be a woman who happens to be queer. And so this kind of the intersections of that, those nuances, brings a different type of experience than what I would find in a textbook, particularly if there's a textbook from a period or an era where these conversations weren't happening. So engaged pedagogy makes room for the realities of the lived experience. And it says that authentic voices, those who are coming authentically, carry wisdom. It's already giving the benefit of the doubt in assuming, right, that there's wisdom in these authentic voices. I'm already giving people the platform, even students, to share what they have. Now, think about what that does for a young person to be given that type of space to share wisdom that they've learned, to be considered someone who is wise and someone who has something to offer. Imagine what that does for them to be able to share in that capacity in that way, versus always being the receiver and kind of, examining their lives through this predetermined lens. Engage pedagogy. I love this all or nothing. And what that means is that we don't get to do these gray areas where we are saying, for example, in these gray areas, um, uh, where there's neutrality, where we don't have to, we just don't have to talk about that thing over there. We don't have to have this discussion about that. Let's just stay focused on this area in this safe space, right? But engaged pedagogy isn't necessarily safe in regards to kind of societal standards, right? This is a space where we are telling hard truths in love. And there are really hard lines and boundaries to cross. We have to be honest about the realities and the experiences, because if experience carries authority, then that means that if someone's experience if there's been harm in their experience or violence in their experience or racism in their experience or something like that, if that is the case, then we have to be honest about that. We can't sweep that under the rug. Traditional pedagogy doesn't necessarily make room because we're only talking about facts and data largely. It doesn't oftentimes make room for these experiences and for the aftermath, the ripple effects. But truly, in engaged pedagogy, then, if experience carries authority and I'm a student, then my lived experience is a part of the learning journey, which means that my journey with culture and oppression should be considered as part of the teaching methodologies. You see how that went? So if all of this is happening, engaged pedagogy, then my lived experience as someone who's here qualifies me to be both student and teacher, and means that my experience in my body, in my skin, should be considered in teaching methodologies. And so I say routinely, I go to these two questions. Where and how do these elements arise in your learning space? If you're looking at your own curriculum and you're saying, oh, I wonder, I'm wondering about some of these things and where do I see them? Where do you see, for example, and you can go down the list, where do you see in your learning space where experience carries authority? Where do you see intersectional opportunities happening? What clear and tangible examples of each of these criteria can you consistently identify in the curriculum that you design and or implement in your context? Where do you see that culture and oppression is consistently integrated in the curriculum that you're teaching? This is engaged. We're talking about anti-racism. Where do you see that it's a conversation? Right? And I gave this example last week about math class. People think it's just math class, but my goodness, there are mathematicians of color. There are all types of ways that math has been used in anti-racism settings. There are all types of ways where we can talk about the math of redlining. There are all types of ways where we can integrate math to use and to talk about this in these ways. So what I'm saying to you is, like, even in this space, as you're kind of in your own mind now, examining, thinking about your lens, if you're moving and you're considering an engaged pedagogy, these are questions to ask. Can I consistently identify that these spaces here are being created using the curriculum that I have? Can I specifically do that? Is that something that I can specifically do? Right? Can I identify that? Can I identify these consistently in the curriculum that I have here? All right. And why do I say that? Because when I'm leaning toward here, oh, it's yelling at me. Let's see. There we go. Is something is holistic, right? I'm leaning toward this holistic. So I went Merriam-Webster, and I went looking for just a definition of holistic, right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the difference. Traditional is not necessarily holistic. Let's look at this. Holistic, the definition is relating to or concerned with wholes or complete systems, complete, rather than with the analysis of treatment of or dissection into parts. Okay, the whole. So if I'm only focusing, I'm gonna go on back up here. So if I'm only focusing on this traditional learning, and I'm focusing on these standards, even going back up here to these long established customs. If I'm focusing on the standards of moral and social conduct, if this is kind of this is what I'm focusing on in traditional education, holistic, then this is only part of the lens. Right? This focuses on one part of the lived experience, on one part of the lens, on one person's perspective or one group's perspective. When we're looking at holistic, we're talking about the entire person. And I love that with this definition, it's an adjective, right? So we're describing something. It almost to me feels like I almost want to say that I want it to be an action word. I want it to be a verb, an action word, right? But we're talking about the whole person. If we're talking about this, and this is what CYF ministry should be, this is what the gospel is. We're talking about a holistic gospel that isn't just focusing on one particular identity or one particular element, right? But the entire person, the entire being. So I found this, I thought this was so cute. I found this little mirror because I think about this. I think about what does that mean for us in terms of, as we're looking for qualifiers of anti-racism education and the scaffolding. We know for sure that we should be looking at engaged pedagogical practices, which we just did a deep dive in. But now let's look into this here, into what it means then as qualifiers too. So not only are we talking about the content and what's being taught, but we're also talking about who's teaching it. Look at a holistic approach related to the wholes. Well, if I'm looking at my lived experience, I'm looking at, I'm looking at physical, I'm looking at emotional, I'm looking at spiritual, right? I'm looking at societal, I'm looking at all these different ways that I enter and engage in the world is a holistic space. And so if I'm looking for an anti-racism education that brings a holistic approach, then that's for everybody. Everybody would be, the goal is to have a curriculum that is holistic for every single person, which means that there is room for this engaged pedagogical approach in relation to lived experience, in regards to lens, in regards to image, right? In regards to advocacy and modeling. Let's look at what that looks like. If I'm bringing in and I'm talking about my lived experience, I'm bringing in an anti-racism education, even in CYF. One of the things that we have been taught, and not just in faith spaces, but just in learning spaces, we've learned over the years how important it is. Studies have shown how important it is for students to see people who look like them in leadership positions in their spaces. How important it is for people to be able, and we know this, right? If you turn on the TV, and you're looking at what's on TV. Do I see, a lot of the messages? Remember, traditional learning approaches, the classroom may change, the container may change, but the traditional methodologies continue. So if I'm only seeing as people that are on my screen that I want to become and embody are white, identifying as male, Christian, middle, upper class, are straight, right? Like these sorts of things, then that's what tells me that's a standard that is being set. Okay. And that standard that's being set here, that's the message that is being sent. And so all these studies we've seen over the years, these recent years, have shown how important it is that we diversify what we're seeing on TV, that we diversify. Have you seen some of these practices, even for people to do these self-exploration practices? If you are on social media, to go on social media and just pay attention, look at your friends list. How many of them are the same, would identify as the same ethnicity as you, or have the same mindset as you, right? So they're saying that we tend to gravitate toward these different spaces. If it's in our control, we gravitate toward spaces that align with who we are, that resonate with our experience. Right. This is who we are. But if we turn on TVs and we turn on our learning spaces, we just see another mimicking, another copy, Xerox copy. I'm old enough for Xerox copy of what we're seeing in the classroom. And we're being taught that this is the epitome. And so for someone who we know the studies are saying that we should see people that look like us, that's what helps with raising self-esteem. Now, we know that may not be the goal of people who are actively working to continue to permeate racism in our society. But as a whole, when we're thinking about if we're moving toward a space that we're hoping to move toward a society of justice, of reconciliation, of healing, of repair, then we have to look at where the breakdowns have happened. And so if we're saying that this is the case, and we want to make sure, first thing is looking at, are there things around? Are there people that look like me in these different positions, which let me know is from an esteem and a character space that I can aspire to and reach in those spaces. Remember the Cape Town? They couldn't even aspire. So to even be able to see these people in positions tells me that I can aspire to those positions. You see? And so I'm looking around to see, do people look like me? But not only do they look like me, I'm also looking at, and this is kind of, 101, but like, looking at your books and looking at your pictures and your images that are on your walls, and what are the messages that are being sent already that tell me, even without us we could never have a conversation, but I would already know where priority is being held based upon what I see. So yes, there is an important for holistic is looking at what are the images, that are being presented of leadership, and can I find myself, whoever I am, in these images. But in addition to that, it also is really important, not just for, to be seen and not heard. Sometimes people of color are brought into leadership positions and they're just expected to be window dressing. So we just need you to be the image of someone in here. We don't need you to say anything, but just to look pretty and stand right here. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm also talking about, look at this, lived experience, the sharing of lived experiences. So not only is it important for me to see someone that looks like me in these roles, but to hear their experiences, to understand their challenges, to really to model my life and my movement after theirs. This is important for me to recognize. I wouldn't know those things if I didn't have access to people that shared in these elements of my lived experience. I wouldn't have any idea. I wouldn't know that. And so when we're thinking about qualifiers of anti-racism education from a holistic perspective, yes, it is important to integrate a variety of images and voices that model, that mirror not only the demographic of the students and the people that you are serving right now, but also the demographic of the students that you hope to serve in the future. So who you want to be, the here and the not yet. So just because you have someone who's African American in your youth group, it doesn't mean that you don't need someone who is of Asian descent to be in leadership as well, right? It means that we all learn from each other, and there's so much that we all can learn from each other from these lenses to create a holistic education. Holistic education creates a holistic individual. Right. And so we want to make sure that there's room and it becomes not a treat, but a consistent folding into the curriculum. And so now we're talking about, not just images and not just voices, but experiences. And this is relationship building. This is important for me to recognize that I see people, not just people that have surpassed the journeys. I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I think it's a good example. I think about Oprah Winfrey and how so many of us know Oprah for where she is right now in this space, in this that many would deem successful and widespread and influential. But look at how much time from my screen, this little bit is where we are right now. Look at all this space, her journey, what she went to, the adversity, the challenges, the help that she received, the help that she needed that she didn't get, these elements of her journey which are critical to the formation of others that are coming up after her. And yet we rarely hear this portion of her story because we're so focused on highlighting the flashiness of her success. Excuse me, but this piece over here is critical as well because these are the formative years. And these are years that will be important for others that are coming up after her to be able to navigate and to hear about. And so even hearing about these things, look what happens as someone who's going through, who may be journeying through similar challenges, what it could mean for me to hear about her story and her adversity and the closed doors and her perseverance, what it could mean for me to be able to hear these things from someone who's still pressing through and persevering. Right. So when I'm saying this, I'm saying that from a holistic perspective, it is so important to have all of these pieces. It is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. What I'm saying and what I'm asking for and proposing, it is a lot of work because the reality is that we honestly don't have these types of things that I'm talking about. The reason why this conversation is so important is because it's rare. We don't really talk about the fact that even our anti-racism education is considered racism. Anti-racism, if we can say that everyone has value and everyone has opportunity and everyone is important, then we can say, then we check this box. But truly, some of the questions I even asked last week were, is this uplifting? When I walk away from this lesson, when I walk away from this session, is it uplifting? Does every person feel as if they have been uplifted or they've been poured into, as if they've been seen? Or does it sound like it's kind of for a different audience or a particular group of people? Does it sound like maybe I have to adjust my lens a little bit and close my eye like this so I can align it with who I am? You see how so much of that squinting has to happen when the curriculum or when the learning context isn't necessarily for them. They've got to mold and contort and do this to kind of squeeze in. But we're talking about an importance that's here to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to be able to engage and experience the beauty and the awesomeness of a holistic anti-racism education. And so all of these parts are important. Yes, it is important to know that Jesus loves every person. It is important to know, if you are someone who subscribes to Protestant Christianity theology, that Jesus loves every person. It is important to know the elements of the gospel. These things are really important, and we cannot bring a holistic lesson without addressing or responding. Look at this: analysis, treatment, dissection of the parts that make us who we are. We just can't. And so we've got to make room for that. We're in a space now where, we can't deny, the news is here. People are getting information in minutes and seconds now. Our young people know what's happening. The question is, who's going to talk about it? Who's going to talk about it? Who's going to dive into it and have real conversations? That's what young people are looking for. They're looking for real, authentic conversations. They're looking to be heard. And this is why I say that even as I don't want to make you dizzy, but even as we look here, and we think about these, I almost want to say that, we're thinking about marginalized people. There we go. Up here, one more. That youth are part of this. that youth are part of our minority is what I'm saying, that they are underrepresented group, that we don't listen, we don't hear, we don't tune in to youth as well. And we don't consider that their experience is authority. We assume they don't have much to offer because they're young people and they haven't lived, as long as some of us have. And we assume that they're there to just be receptors, receivers of what we have because that's how the curriculum is laid out. When we're thinking about qualifiers of anti-racism education, then we have to make sure that it speaks into all parts of people and their individuals and their experiences. We want to make sure that this is the direction that we're going toward. And what does that truly look like? I want to just I'll tell you where we're going next for next week before I'm quiet so we can answer some questions. But let's talk about some of these things. So one of the first things I look at are leadership. If we're looking into certain spaces, some would consider that considered lay or clergy and rostered leadership. We look at like image wise, persona wise, who is in leadership. That is definitely important, but also who is in mentorship. Who are people that are able to mentor? If we don't have someone who looks like, right, who represents these different groups, underrepresented groups that's here, and their voices are definitely still important, where can we go to find mentors that would be willing to contribute, or community members? There are intersections, tons of nonprofit organizations that are aligned in their audience and their work and the level of urgency that we're bringing to this discussion that would definitely be receptive to partnering with faith-based organizations to provide some additional perspectives. And a lot of them already have funding to do this work and just don't have a place to land. Sometimes, and I'll come back to the innovate and supplement. Other also is to review other models for underrepresented people in curriculum. What other models are already out there? I live in the Twin Cities, and there is an awesome group, an awesome organization called Upstream, and it really focuses on people that are growing and are navigating the life with different abilities. And what I love about it is because of that, because of their work, they've had to incorporate a variety of different tools to be able to bring this information forward. And it leads me to wonder, what could we learn from some of these practices? How could we bring some of these models and modes that we learn from other spaces into our curriculum already? Perhaps we know, because we have to know that we're in a space where minimization, right? Our most progressive space is minimization, where we're in a space where, what we see, everyone is loved, everyone is held. This message that we have is the most progressive message that we have, and it is the most radical message that we have in relation to our world, is that everyone is loved and everyone has love and everyone is worthy of love. And yet, if we can't find a curriculum, it may mean that we have to supplement with some of these other spaces that we have here. We may have to integrate, because the reality is that we may not have something that's already created from what we're creating the road as we're building it. And that means that you may have to make a checklist, like I did with, like we did here. It may mean that you have to say, can I find these things? It may mean that there's some additional work that would have to go. It's a lot of hard work. And the reason is because, honestly, in our society, we're not largely in our society in the business of anti-racism, are we? I mean, the racism is pretty fruitful and profitable in our society. And so finding these things to interrupt that system is may be challenging. And that's why the conversation is so needed. It requires innovation and relationship and exploring in some of these other ways. All right, I want to stop sharing for a moment for right now, because I want to open up, as I said, I want to open up the floor to answer questions that we didn't get a chance to answer last week, or that have come from this conversation today. There's a lot of information. I know I did. What's percolating in your minds and your spirits right now?
Okay, I'm going to start with a few that we didn't get to last time, and we'll go
Okay.
from there. And again, Apologies, everyone. You should be able to drop a question into the chat at this point to the host and panelists. So last week, someone wrote, in my experience as a teacher, the system itself is set up only for the majority. Exclusionary treatment was rampant as of 2022. This brings to mind the context of a system. Where do you see hope in an individual working within a given system as they implement these frameworks?
I love that question. I love the question of hope because this can be it's a very this can be a very sad conversation to have, right? I mean, it's a hard conversation to have. So I love the fact that we're pointing, excuse me, toward hope. Um, I see hope. Well, let me say it this way. I see hope in connecting with other people that have the same hope and passion for this work. I tell people like we can't do this alone. I have so many multiple networks and circles of people that I will reach out to. This is hair pulling, discussions to have. And you're right, it is hard to be able to kind of to break through some of these ironclad systems that are designed to keep us stagnant in this discussion and in this space. And yet, having other circles, other conversation partners gives me hope in knowing that I'm not alone in my work, that the gaslighting that tends to happen, right? That isn't happening. That's important. I see hope in an individual in continuing to keep trying. And continuing to to cultivate the relationships that are needed. When I see our young people that are continuing to come back, that are continuing to engage and to ask questions, and actually want to have these conversations, that gives me hope. Because they're willing to engage and have the discussions. Young people are looking for these conversations. They're looking for people that will answer these questions honestly, and they're hoping for that. So I find hope in my colleagues. I find hope in my why. I continue to remind myself, why is this important to me? Whether it's journaling or having, what you can't see behind my screen are tons of quotes and things that I have. Perhaps I find hope in other people that are passionate about this work. And I also find hope celebrating let me just say this, every single inch of growth. Sometimes we live in a space where, and I say it seems like we're throwing a cup of water in a forest fire when we're having this discussion, because it's just so rampant. Racism is so rampant, and it is steeped in our systems and in our frameworks, and it is literally like DNA. Like, how are you going to get it out? And it can feel like that, but the smallest advance, I celebrate every little win. More kids coming, that gives me hope. A conversation that took a turn gives me hope. Right? So every little bit, even which is countercultural to us, I celebrate because it makes a difference. And that matters. So we gotta change even our evaluative frameworks to gauge success. We have to change that a bit, so that we can actually see the wins and see the gains as they are.
Thank you. One of our participants today, who is both a current teacher in public education and someone working in ministry, and has shared a little bit about how difficult moving from traditional to an engaged approach to anti-racism education is in the public school, and feels the teachers are kind of just imprisoned in the system.
Yep.
How would you advise someone who is both a teacher and a ministry begin to incorporate these things while the system seems to continue to move at a snail's pace?
Great question, and I love that. It's true. Sales pace is definitely accurate in that. First of all, thank you for your service, and for sharing so much of yourself with our students in both of these sectors. Thank you for your heart. Clearly, you're a passionate educator to do this as your life's work, and so thank you for that, and for staying in it. Um, uh, so I think thinking about the best way that I want to answer the question. I think one of the first things that is important is uh, you're right. When you're in a public school setting, there are definitely some cement frameworks and some obstacles and boundaries that you cannot that you can't move through. But even beginning to do things like and I'm gonna share my screen again just for a second because I think all right, I think it could be helpful. So some of the things, for example, starting to invite people to share their thoughts, students to share their thoughts, to invite, even in the classroom, to begin to invite more conversation, to invite more sharing and storytelling, to validate people's students' experiences. Ways where you even in that to be able to give people spaces to be able to share their thoughts and their feelings is one move toward toward an engaged pedagogy because now you're giving them voice, creating spaces, even in these spaces, perhaps you're right, even within the confines of or the limitations of public school spaces, as well as the limitations and confines of limited budgets and youth ministry. Right? There are tons of volunteers, requests for volunteers, even inviting participants in. I always explore partnerships. We'll talk more about this next week because we'll be digging into specifically how to locate and develop these resources. But cultivating relationships with, again, and I see where I found this intersectional space where there are here we are right here where there are people and organizations that may be in different areas of like different sectors of education, but have a shared interest in the outcome that you do. There may be ways to develop and cultivate these partnerships that in ways that don't violate the guidelines that are listed for in your public school settings, and then also can still meet the standards and terms within youth ministry. So I always say to people, if you're looking for a starting point, I always start here, and I start by one sharing. Allowing people to share. So this experience carries authority and giving people room to be able to share and validate their experience, modeling what it looks like to listen and to support other people in their journeys, even if they don't mirror our own, are some things that can happen in a classroom, even if you have these other constraints that I talked about. So I think your own vulnerability would be important, depending on the age. Definitely age appropriate, but then also allowing other folks to definitely share. And depending on the age, again, age appropriate. But there's always opportunity to add and supplement with discussion of culture and oppression, regardless. I mean, you can find. I lifted this up because I'll talk about it next week. Matthew 5:39. But some of the things that happen is like in every discussion, we can find a gateway to culture. We can definitely find one. Yeah.
Okay.
So I hope that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, and this next question ties in nicely with this, and I'm going to ask you maybe if you could give a specific example or recommendation. But those who work with children and youth deal with a typical education model, especially in church school, and it's very common for workers in that space to have to do things like children have to memorize prayers or a psalm as certain faith formation developmental points. Basically, we're
Mm-hmm.
asking them to memorize and then recite, right? So
Uh-huh.
let's say that you're a youth worker or you're someone working in a church school context and you have limited power in the system to kind of change that educational model. What might be a baby step that you could do to move it in the direction of engagement while still having to honor those requirements?
Um, that's a great question. One of the as I'm sure many people, if you are for me as a pastor in Protestant Christianity, this is my lens, right? And so I'm speaking from that lens. And if you are not, then you can take this and carry it over to your own faith tradition. But I remember, doing Bible memory verses in church all the time. I remember going to children's church, right? Or some people may call it Sunday school. And that was important. And it was a big deal to memorize it. And sometimes we'd get in front of the congregation and we'd say it out loud, and it was a really big deal. And so those pieces, I think it's important. I'm not saying that oral recitation is a problem, is problematic. What I'm saying is that it's problematic without context, without information. So I think Bible memory would be is a wonderful thing if it comes equipped with wonderful lessons and conversations and discussions about it. So I can say, for example, for God so loved the world, right? And I can quote John 3:16, and I can do that, and that is fine. But what about this? Here we are again. Do you see my screen? That's just right here. But the big piece is the conversations, breaking down that verse and having conversations with youth and with kids about, what does love look like? And what does that really mean? And what does it mean for you? And what does it mean for me? And if somebody loved me that much, what would that feel like for me? And to be able to have some conversations, again, I'm a word person, but to be able to have some conversations about why that verse is important and what it means, and not just what it means in scripture, but what it means for you as the teacher, and what it means for me as the student, and what might it mean for my mom? And oh my goodness, if I'm old enough, if it's appropriate, what could this mean for the guy who's unhoused that's holding the sign outside? What does this mean? And so then if we're having these other conversations, so Bible memory left to its own is just me, that's just regurgitating. But if I can actually spend time like this, now every time I see that person on the corner or another person, or every time I go through this verse, I'm thinking about this. And now it widens my lens. So then the memory verse becomes not the focal point, right? The focal point is the learning and the discussion. It actually becomes the reinforcement of that. Do you see the difference? Where memory verse tends to be the subject, it becomes the reinforcement, and the focus is the learning piece. So you're still meeting your objectives, you're still providing the memory verse, you're still teaching the math lesson, you're still doing the other pieces, but now you're able to allow a widening of discussion, which gives people and students permission to ask different questions and to think about things in different ways, that teaches them to fish for themselves instead of only relying on what the words say here. Because if I can think about how much God loves me and that unhoused person, then when I travel on that accompaniment tour 10 years from now, I'm going to pick this up and move it here and apply it here. And see, that's learning how to fish. And that's what the goal is not for us to become robotic, right? I mean, just followers of a regime, but for us to be thinkers and movers and shakers and doers ourselves, and to be able to apply it in that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, you talked last week about being thoughtful regarding including other traditions in how we gather and in how we teach. Could you say a word about music? There are so many musical genres that can be brought into holy spaces, but some Protestant churches trend towards very Eurocentric musicality. Since music is very connectional, something can really be lost if we stick with just one genre. So at the same time, I know there are some who, when wishing to offer musical diversity, have the desire to honor music from the whole Christian tradition without also wanting to co-opt it or just offer lip service to inclusion. If there's a church that's predominantly white, what are your thoughts about how that church might appreciate multicultural musical diversity in a way that's honorable?
I love this question. I love this question because what you're speaking about is the attentiveness um, uh, to distance ourselves from tokenism and from cultural appropriation, those sorts of things. I'm going to answer in a way that could be considered, well, I wouldn't say controversial, but I'm going to answer and you decide if you feel it's controversial or not. I personally, I have been in a lot of faith spaces. I've journeyed myself through 5 different denominations before being ordained in the Disciples of Christ, a Christian church. And I am an interfaith spiritual director. So I have done a lot of work with different faith traditions beyond Protestant Christianity, and I continue to do so. And one of the things that I have found to be most meaningful, um, this is a part that's controversial, but I'll come back to that. One of the things I find to be most meaningful is when authentic partnerships can happen and when we can come together and worship together in these different styles where we can celebrate the styles that we are each that we're bringing together. So if I've been I was pastoring a congregation and we had partnerships with other churches of different ethnicities, and we came together for a shared worship and sang, and they sang songs and shared music in this way, which was really great to be able to hear this music being sung in ways and intonations and in paces that they were intended to be versus being appropriated. And I say that because I remember um, uh, not a couple years ago having a conversation with someone, and it made it was a big deal, at least in the Twin Cities it was, about taking old Negro spirituals and correcting the words, right? So that's missing a G at the end. That they right and thinking it was helpful when actually harmful. And there's a piece of that. And so honorably, it'd be great to bring to have a shared experience for people to hear these things in dialects and intonations that they were intended, and to be able to honor them as what they are, right? I read an article recently, for example, about cornrows, and how cornrows, which has been a big subject of cultural appropriation, were actually largely used as maps so that people who were enslaved would know where to go and where to turn. Very important, a very important piece that I would not want to hijack, right? And that's so important to take that and to soften that down for it to be for a visual experience, for another experience. Then it takes away this piece. So one thing I would say is I think it's important to cultivate relationships. We tend in our society to really lean into siloed churches where we just want to recreate it ourselves. We'll just sing it ourselves. We'll do it ourselves. But there's value in community. Is there any reason why we couldn't go down the street to the other faith space, their community, and break bread and have some coffee and plan a wonderful service where we could do things together? So one of the first things I would say would be, to go to the source. And if you are wanting then to, and there are times when I've even seen some musicians, like even of some of those spirituals I talked about, that when there was a shared, they actually taught, they taught, we're going to do a group, like a community-wide gospel choir, and we're going to teach this together in this dialect, and here's the reasons why. Remember, this is just this small piece of the performance or the song. All of this is important, but it changes everything when you hear about the cornrows and the maps, doesn't it? It changes so much. But if I just am showing you cornrows, that's all you see. And so there's something different when there's education that comes with it, when there's reasons, when there's whys, when people can have that understanding. I think that's a way where it can be honorable, to have some of these conversations. If you can't sing the song, or you can't provide the music in the way that it was intended, then we should do our best. Again, remember I put authentic. So we want to try to do our best to find the sources and the spaces where it can be considered, where it can be offered in that way. Because we assume that our intentions guide us. That's a fallacy. Like if I'm coming in as someone who's new to your congregation, I'm not assuming best intent. that's a construct that comes where, people of color versus white folks, and how that goes. But intent versus impact, you have to earn that respect. So if I'm walking into a space, my daughter walked into a church last year. She was a college student. She texted me from the church, predominantly white. This is a true story. Their opening hymn was uh, was an old time Negro spiritual, and she was the only African American person in the entire congregation, and she felt it was hard for her to sing a song about freedom in a space, right, like wrapped around, and she ultimately got up and she left. And while their intentions were, I'm sure I sent an email to the pastor, and so while their intentions were positive, which is great, right? The harm that can happen is what we're also guiding against as well. So I'm big on authenticity. If you're sharing music, if you're listening to music, to give it the due that it is, because it is a part of the work, and it's a part of the learning experience.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the chat, but one of our attendees today shared in their church context, they do a lot of teaching about names of God and exclusive male gender pronouns, and also work hard to keep blood sacrifice song language at bay. But they have a legacy of suffering, HIV and AIDS crisis. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for good or not, it says for good or not, I get pushback and use that as teaching opportunities. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And it really goes back to our fundamental values on what church is, right? So if church is a space of comfort, right? Are we coming to, we want to be comfortable. We don't want to talk about politics. Some people go and they don't want to talk about the hard stuff. And that's not right. And they deal with the hard stuff 6 days a week. And that's not what they want to do. And my goodness, and now you're bringing up more of this stuff. Can't we just come in here? I need to come in here and hear that Jesus loves me today. That's just like literally all I need to hear, right? And that is the case. And you can hear that. And Jesus loves you. And look at how much that is. And Jesus loves you in all of this other stuff that we have to talk about. These spaces are here too. And so I think I mean, you're not alone in that. I say the same thing, darkness and lightness imagery and things like that, and how challenging it is. But that's why I say that criteria, when people leave out of the space, can everybody say that they feel seen and uplifted? Would I feel seen and uplifted if I sang a song that says I'm as white as snow? Right? Like, if I'm looking around, can everybody who's been present, every trans person, every woman, every elderly, can everybody say that they find themselves upheld and held in whatever the experience is? And if not, then there's more worm there, because if we're not healing, then we're harming. So then there's room. Then we have work to do. And pushback is sadly, but honestly, I mean, that is a part of the reality, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, pushback definitely does happen. And it does get back to that. What are we going to church for?
Yeah.
Yes.
We do have a lot of work to do, and I see that we're at time, so we're going to honor that for everyone. But thank you so much for this, and we will look forward to being back here with the Reverend Dr. Gia Star Brown next Wednesday, 12 o'clock Eastern, for our third and final session. So thank you so much, Gia, and thank you everyone for being with us.
Thanks so much. See you next week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.